Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Is everyone going to be able to vote this November, and will your vote count? That's something we worry about, and not only about it in Florida. Doug Kellner is a leading advocate for election reform. In 1993, he was appointed the Democratic Commissioner from Manhattan to the Board of Elections, where his voice continuously clamors for reform after reform. Hello.
Well, thanks very much, Ronnie.
I love having reformers on the program.
I love being called a reformer.
Is New York, well, you are, right?
We try.
Is New York's system better or worse in the middle compared to the other states?
I'd say it's in the middle. We have some very good points about our system, and we have problems, a lot of the problems that come just from the sheer size of it.
And we're one of the we're not the largest population anymore, are we? But at the side, but no. California system, how does that compare?
I think we're better than California. California has a lot of problems, both with the voting technology that they use to count the votes, as well as how they communicate with voters to get people on the registration rolls and out to the polls.
So when you're an elections commissioner, or when you're concerned about elections, one is access to being able to vote, right?
Yeah.
How you vote, how your vote gets counted.
That's right. And I also add one of the big things in New York is getting on the ballot in the first place.
That's true.
New York is one of the most difficult states to get on a primary ballot.
That's long been an interest of yours.
That's correct.
And but that's not the city, that's the state.
That's state law that sets that. I remember I wrote an article 15 years ago when the State Department was condemning the Sandinista government of Nicaragua, complaining that they didn't have free elections, and I was showing that it was easier to run for the National Assembly in Nicaragua than it was for the State Assembly in New York.
But unless we reform the legislative system in Albany, are we ever going to get any place?
Well, we have to keep talking about it.
Right. What are the largest problems that we face in the city?
Well, the biggest is just getting people to register to vote, and then making sure that those registration records are available on Election Day and that people know that to go to the correct place so that they can vote on a voting machine.
What's it estimated, what percentage of the total population that's eligible to vote actually registers?
Actually, it's reasonably high in New York. It's over 90%.
Is that right?
That's
but
right.
It's not 90% participation. I mean, it's back down to the
only about half of the registered voters actually vote in a presidential election. And among some groups, that figure is much lower, particularly young people. That's the single largest group of people who aren't registered to vote. We need to do more in the high schools. And
why, if you're male and you have to register for the Army, why can't you register to vote at the same time?
Actually, you can.
I mean, we had that discussion.
I don't know how many people actually register
Oh,
nowadays.
well, that's true too.
But
yeah, it's but there should be some place where you register.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's certainly something that people have been paying attention to. Every government agency is required to notify you of your option to register to vote whenever you interact with that agency. So if you apply for a driver's license, there's a voter registration form at the bottom of your driver's license application.
And you can't make people register to vote.
No.
No. But New York has, is that from the Board of Elections, the booklet with the candidates and their positions, or that's from the Campaign Finance Board?
Only for people running for city office, and that's published by the Campaign Finance Board.
Right. One of the major issues, it seems to me, is, well, in Florida, the issues have been what? The ability to vote. Finding your name in
First
the book.
of all, they've purged voters from the voter registration list in ways that are clearly discriminatory. And we could go into that if you want. So that's one issue.
Do all states purge voters lists?
Well, you have to purge the voters lists one way or another.
Because of people who've died?
People move.
How do you know when somebody's moved?
Well, in New York, that's the big problem in New York, that there is what's called the national change of address list that the post office publishes. So if you file a change of address card with the post office, that notifies the Board of Elections that you've moved, except 10% of the people who file change of address cards with the post office don't mean to change their voter registration. So that creates a little quirk. It shows it's a difficult process. It's not a simple process keeping track of 4 million registered voters.
So the Board of Elections purges during the year? Is there
There's actually two levels in New York law that we have a thing called the inactive list. So if the board thinks that you've moved, you go on the inactive list. And then if you come and you show up to vote and you say, my name's not in the book, well, you can vote by affidavit ballot, and then they'll look and they'll see. And if you were on the inactive list because they lost track of you, your ballot will be counted. And also in New York, if you have moved within the city, you don't actually have to re-register. Again, if you go to the polling place of your new residence, your name won't be in the book, but if you vote by affidavit ballot, then the Board of Elections will update your record, activate your registration at the new address, and then you'll be in the book for the new address.
Can anybody, if you sign an affidavit, vote in a certain place? But you have to go...
If you're registered to vote and your name isn't in the book of the election district where your residence is located, then your registration will be updated and an affidavit ballot will count.
Right. But when do you have to go to court? When do you have to go downtown and get a court order?
You never have to get a court order anymore.
Oh, good.
Because the affidavit ballot was designed to replace the court order.
Well,
but if you're one of those people who says, I don't want to vote on paper, I want to absolutely make sure my vote is on the machine, then you do have the option of going to see a judge on election day. And the judge will sign a court order if the judge believes you're entitled to vote.
I really want to, I'm asking you all these little questions.
Okay.
I really want to talk a larger scheme, but anyway. Purging the list. In Florida, they purge the lists. They just put people on who are felons allowed to vote any place?
Well, Florida has a stricter law than New York. New York does not allow felons who are actually serving time to vote. But once you've finished your parole, in other words, if you've gone to jail and then you're released on parole, you can't vote while you're on parole. But when your parole is finished, then you are eligible to vote again in New York. Florida does not let you do that. Florida says once you're convicted of a felony, you forfeit your right to vote for the rest of your life.
And there are no national standards. There's no national legislation or anything.
No.
Is that an appealable thing? I mean, can you ask the court for that kind of...
There is a court case that was brought by the Brennan Center for Justice in Florida challenging the Florida law. And the courts so far have ruled that the Florida law is constitutional, that's a decision for the people of each state to make in their own state constitution.
You said before that California's system isn't as good as ours. Florida had all the problems with the chads and the machines. We're still voting with these old voting machines.
I love these old voting machines, right. But we'll start out by saying that right now these old voting machines become illegal in 2006. So that New York is required by federal law to replace the voting machines. And the reason for that, there are 24 national standards for voting machines. New York complies with 23 of them. The one that we don't comply with is that the machine has to be fully accessible to the disabled, including visually impaired voters. So a blind person has to be able to vote on a voting machine without assistance. And nobody's figured out a way to make these mechanical machines available to blind voters.
And they can't vote on a ballot. They have to have it on the machine.
Well, the federal law requires that.
Now, who did the federal law? Why does the federal law do that and set standards for that and not, for instance, for people with criminal records?
Well, that was the decision that Congress made in the Help America Vote Act, which was enacted in 2001 in response to the Florida debacle.
Oh, and so this is a new thing.
This is a new law that was passed by Congress, and this is the first time Congress has ever made national voting standards.
That's very interesting. Well, what's going to happen in New York? We've had a long history of problems with new voting methods.
Right.
You were a strong opponent, and I think I was too in the council, but we had already spent millions and millions of dollars, right? When was that, in 1992?
Well, in 1992, New York City signed a contract to buy electronic voting machines. And of course, I went on the Board of Elections in 1993. And one of the reasons I sought to get on the Board of Elections was because I really believed that we were making a mistake, because there was no way to verify that an electronic voting machine of the type New York was going to buy was counting the votes the way the voter actually cast them. In our mechanical machines, the voter may not see all the mechanical works in the back of the machine, but trust me that in 2 or 3 hours, I can teach anybody how that machine is set up and how it works, and you can see the guts and the works of the machine. But when you're voting on a computer, you can't see how the machine is programmed. And it is not very difficult to program a machine to say, take every 10th vote in column A and switch it to column B. And it's impossible to check that with the type of machine that we were going to buy then, and the type of machine that is being commonly purchased in many jurisdictions throughout the country today.
Right. That's what do they call? I mean, they want people who are interested really in the purists, or the people who are really interested in reform like you. If you do computerize it, you want a
voter verifiable paper audit trail, which means that use the electronic machine to produce a paper ballot or a piece of paper that shows the voter how that machine is counting the vote. And then, without the voter ever even touching the paper would drop into a ballot box, a sealed box in the machine, so that at the end of the day you can get instant results from the computer, but then later on you can open up that sealed box and count the ballots by hand and see if the machine counted the votes the same way that the voters saw them.
Does any state have that system?
Nevada has it in place now for the 2004 presidential election. 5 other states have required it in their legislation. And in New York, both the Senate and the Assembly have passed bills that would require it, but they haven't got the same text of the bill yet, so that in New York, we still don't have any law dealing with updating the voting
Do you have strong
machines.
Objections to either one of those 2 bills?
No, I would support both of them.
And is there a chance that, what year is it that you're supposed to comply with the federal law?
We must have new voting machines by the 2006 general election.
So that's only 2 years. How are you going to do that? And
it's already too late. Eventually somebody is going to bring a lawsuit. Well, actually, only the Attorney General of the United States can bring the lawsuit, but eventually they will bring a lawsuit to compel New York to comply with the Federal Help America Vote Act. And a federal judge is going to have to supervise the process of buying new machines and
why are we having this problem? Because the houses can't, the Senate and the Assembly can't get together?
That's true. That's exactly it.
How long have the bills been in the 2 houses?
Well, since the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2001.
That's so incredible.
The Assembly very quickly passed a bill that would have implemented it, and the Senate passed a bill that was more restrictive on voters' rights, but the 2 houses have had great difficulty coming together on elections issues. And there are a lot of partisan election administration issues that are holding up an agreement on this because of actions that Governor Pataki and the Republican Party have taken.
Well, that was one of the underlying things that has always interested me about the election process, and that is the question of ethics and conflicts of interest. I mean, it seems to me historically, and it's certainly when we first started on the computerized machines in '92 or before when they started, and I've read that members of boards of elections or people who are doing the purchasing or writing the legislation are also frequently consultants to the companies who are making these machines, right?
Well, and worse, there was a bribery scandal in the purchase of the voting machines leading up to that 1992 contract. One of the commissioners was convicted of taking bribes. And the voting machine industry has now become a major industry and a player in itself, and spends an awful lot of money both on the political side with legislators and on the administrative side, wining and dining elections officials to get them to buy their voting equipment.
So how are we ever going to change that?
It's not easy. What it really takes is for people to pay attention to the system, and it's very interesting. From my end, from 1993 until about 2002, very few people were paying attention to the difficulty of verifying computer voting. And then all of a sudden, a few academics started raising the issue, and it caught fire with the press, and now almost everybody who follows it understands exactly what we're talking about when we say there's the need for a verifiable audit trail if you have computer voting. That happened because people who had no partisan stake to grind started spending time advocating, and unfortunately that's what it takes. The citizenry has to pay attention to their voting process. They can't take it for granted.
What do you think New York City has done? I mean, where did we start? How did we originally vote? Paper ballot?
Well, actually, people met and they went to meetings and raised their hands to vote.
And, so like the Iowa caucuses or something?
That's right. That people met in the town hall in the towns, and in cities they met usually at a church in the ward and had a ward meeting, and they elected their people by show of hands. And it wasn't until the early 1800s when paper ballots were introduced in New York. And the reason they had paper ballots was that at these meetings, people would say, okay, who are we going to vote for member of the assembly? And everyone would say, all right, we're going to vote for John Smith. And okay, how many people are going to vote for Jerry Jones? And some people would vote for Jerry Jones, but the town clerk would simply write down that all of the eligible voters, whether they showed up at the meeting or not, had voted for a particular candidate. So they said, well, we need ballots so we can actually count them and see and make sure that you actually showed up to vote, and that we're only counting the votes of the people who voted for that person, and we do count the votes for people who didn't vote that way. But you know, Ronnie, when they started with paper ballots, the government didn't print the ballots. People had to provide their own ballots. And that's how the political parties formed. That groups of people would get together and say, okay, here's the ticket of the people we want you to vote for. And they'd hand out this ticket, and that's what you would put in the ballot box. And it was civic organizations. Tammany Hall started out as a civic organization, and they would endorse candidates for public office. And their candidates became so successful over time that the National Democratic Party would seek their endorsement, and they became the local wing of the National Democratic Party in New York. And but until the 1880s, all you had to do to run for office was to print tickets and pass them out at the polls and ask people to vote that ticket. And that's where we get our palm cards.
I was going to say today's palm card
is what's left of the ticket. So there were there were two drawbacks with using those paper tickets as ballots. One was that they would print the tickets in colors. The Tammany color, for example, was always green. That's why Democratic Party petitions have been green traditionally. Oh, that's so interesting. And people could counterfeit the ticket. So first of all, there was no secret ballot. You could see what ballot you were doing by which ticket you were putting in the ballot box. And the second thing is that people started counterfeiting the tickets. Well, you didn't get the Tammany endorsement, but
you still made your ticket
you might
look like
want to run for judge, and figure, well, nobody's going to know who the judge candidates are, so they're just going to look at the top of the ticket, and if it looks like the Tammany ticket, you can slip by that way. And then another thing is that you didn't have to announce your tickets in advance. You could wait until the morning of the election to start passing out the tickets, and nobody would know who your candidates were. And the fact that you were running your brother for councilman, who just got out of jail,
we still try to do that, right?
So the big reform in the 1880s was what they called the Australian ballot, where the government printed the ballots, and you voted in secret. And the only drawback with that is that once the government got in the business of printing the ballots, well, what names do they put on the ballots? How do you get onto the ballot? And so that's where we started this process of...
and that was the political influence of deciding who's going to be on the ballot. You're going to make it as hard as possible for smaller independent people, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And then when did the machine come in?
It's interesting that Thomas Edison invented the first voting machine, and New York was the first jurisdiction. Lockport, New York was the first jurisdiction to use voting machines in 1893. But in New York City, there was great resistance to using voting machines. Again, because there were a lot of people employed in counting the paper ballots. And it wasn't until 1922 that voting machines were required for elections.
But I remember working in primaries where we still did it on paper ballots.
It wasn't
in my lifetime.
It wasn't until 1960 that voting machines were required for primaries.
So I sat on a ballot box once. I mean, I was a young kid working at the Westside Democratic Club, and we had a race for, I think, an assemblyman, and I sat on the ballot box so the guys couldn't come. But it is a fascinating thing because it just reflects, I mean, it shows the political influence, all the different things that happen. It's like braided in, right?
Right, and almost all of the changes in our voting process are reforms that are really foisted upon the political establishment.
When it gets so bad.
That's right. Well, or when the public outcry is so great for changes.
Florida was very helpful to us.
Well, the one thing about reform is sometimes there are unintended consequences. So like we talked about 1880, the secret ballot was a good thing and a government printed ballot was a good thing, but did anybody think then, well, now we're going to make it really hard for people to get on the ballot, and so you have other problems. And what happened with Florida is, with good intentions, the federal government has required new voting machines, but they set it up backwards. They set up what's called the United States Election Assistance Commission, which is supposed to develop detailed technical standards for voting machines. But they required that the voting machines be purchased before the U.S. Election Assistance Commission was set up to set the standards. So we don't have any standards other than these 23 general guidelines of how voting machines should be designed, and yet people are buying voting machines. And so we're really experimenting with a lot of voting machines this time in 2004.
So what do you think in 2004, how many states will have accurate, efficient, effective voting systems?
Well, you know, accurate is a relative term in voting because there's no system that's perfect. There's literally no system that's going to count every single vote when you have hundreds of thousands or millions, as you have in New York City, voting. So you want a system that's most accurate and that's most accessible to the voters. And the real problem comes when it's close. So like Florida, the reason we're all paying attention to Florida is it was so close. Now, it's interesting that in New Mexico, it was just as close, but they did not have the same kinds of flaws in their system.
We recently saw some articles about absentee ballots and the increasing use of voting by mail. Oregon was doing that, weren't they, without absentee ballots?
Oregon does not have polling places. 100% of the voters vote by absentee ballot in Oregon.
And what do you think of that system?
Well, I think if we did it in New York, we could get 110% voter turnout. In New York, historically, we've had lots of problems with absentee ballots. And the single area of the greatest amount of fraud that I have observed in my term as elections commissioner, and then before that as an election lawyer for the Democratic Party, has been with absentee ballots. Now, there have been reforms to make some of those schemes
what is it
more
that
difficult.
Originally that the people who got the absentee ballots really are voting, I mean, that they shouldn't be voting that way, or that they're voting twice?
Well, there are two kinds of absentee ballot fraud that we've run into. One is where people have filed phony voter registrations in order to get the absentee ballots and then vote these ballots and send them in. And because you've never actually seen the voter, it's very difficult to verify that the voter exists. And that scheme was caught not in a big election, but in a school board election where the number of voters is so small, and when they realized that they were getting so many people in one place, they were saying something's going on, and they investigated it and uncovered the scheme.
We have 1 minute left. Ooh. I can't believe that. And what's the other one?
The other one was nursing home voting, where somebody who works at the nursing home will intercept the ballots, vote them, and send them back in.
What do you need now to register to vote? You don't need...
All you need is a voter registration form and send it in. if you, the form will ask you for your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, but you can still register without them.
And if you want to vote, all you need to do is to go to your local polling place, and if you haven't moved and your name isn't in the book, you vote by affidavit.
That's right.
And do you think that you're making change? Not fast enough, right?
Not fast enough, but if you're not there, then you're going to let other people make those decisions.
And the public should all pay attention to what's going on.
That's right.
And the press should pay attention to you. And we're very lucky that we have a commissioner like you on the Board of Elections. Thank you very much.